10 years later, the wound still hasn't healed. Valentino Rossi told Crash in November 2025 that Marc Marquez made me lose the championship. The contact at turn 14 that Sunday, fracturing the paddock into tribes that still haven't settled into history. The old king lost his crown while a new faction seized control, and the Valencia penalty froze the betrayal into a sacred violation overnight. We expected the tension to fade once Rossi retired, but the garages just handed the civil war down to the next generation. Rossi called the wound very deep during that same retrospective because he never accepted the official version emotionally. We remember the Valencia grid after Sepang. Rossi got sent to the back, Lorenzo started on pole, and Marquez rode at the front while the whole championship stopped being about lap times. Rossi loyalists saw deliberate sabotage. Marquez supporters saw an old champion losing control under pressure, and race direction twisted the knife by making Rossi start from the back row. Once fans believe somebody interfered with the world title itself, that stain never washes out. The paddock can forgive ordinary racing contact. We watched riders throw away friendships over one dive bomb at the apex, then share data 2 seasons later. Sepang became something else entirely since it touched the championship code. Valentino led the standings at 36 years old, carrying the Italian side of the sport, while a younger rider circled underneath him. When Rossi framed the loss as a theft, the accusation entered permanent history instantly. That burden followed Marquez everywhere, building the opposite mythology where his fans saw him unfairly turned into a political enemy. Nobody argues about normal racing incidents 10 years later. We argue about Sepang because people believed hidden motives sat underneath the riding itself. The Thursday press conference changed the atmosphere forever. Rossi publicly accused Marquez of helping Lorenzo. The smiles vanished immediately, and every session after that carried the tension of a pit lane waiting for someone to snap. Then the race started. Marquez fought like a rider with nothing at stake, and Rossi decided another rider had crossed the sacred line of championship neutrality. Every modern MotoGP controversy gets filtered through that specific afternoon now. Race direction hands out a penalty, and we call it another Sepang. An aggressive overtake happens, and the tribal lines reform immediately. The irony stings when you think about it. Rossi spent decades building this sport into a global emotional machine where personality mattered, and then the biggest emotional storyline swallowed his own title fight whole. The opinions stayed frozen because no reconciliation exists when both versions depend on the other guy being a liar. This civil war didn't start in Malaysia though. Christian Gabarini called the memory indelible when discussing Laguna Seca 2013, confirming that Marquez already made Rossi pay for the 2008 corkscrew pass years before the real war started. We all remember 2008 as Rossi's masterpiece. He threw the Yamaha through the dirt, bullied Casey Stoner off the racing line, and reclaimed the title momentum. But Gabarini admitted he was really angry, much more than Casey, exposing that the Ducati garage viewed the move as an unpunished violation. Stoner walked away from that California afternoon realizing the moral limits he thought existed at the top level were optional. He told Paddock GP that Rossi showed who he really was, a quote that sounds like post-race frustration until you realize it changed Stoner's worldview. Before Laguna, he raced expecting mutual respect. After Laguna, he stopped worrying about anyone else and survived professionally instead of living the sport. The joy disappeared, the trust shattered, and he eventually retired at 27 while the corporate machine kept grinding riders down. Then 2013 happened. Marquez launched the same corkscrew line against Rossi himself, and the entire paddock mood flipped. Gabarini described it like the sport correcting itself, a karmic receipt delivered to the old king by a rookie who skipped the apprenticeship phase. Rossi spent years breaking rivals by making them feel the paddock bending around him. Marquez didn't grow up intimidated by that aura. He grew up watching the clips as inspiration. Using Rossi's own playbook against him carried a brutal status message. That pass stopped belonging to one rider and became inherited territory. Rossi fans called the 2008 move genius, but Stoner fans called it crossing the line. When Marquez repeated the aggression, the reactions flipped depending on which flag people waved. The Ducati garage never forgot losing narrative control to Rossi, so watching a younger rider force Valentino into that same corner felt like poetic justice. MotoGP keeps recycling ghosts, and the corkscrew became the warning shot before the full Malaysian war arrived. The damage spread to the other side of the garage too. Jorge Lorenzo told car and driver that Marquez destroyed my race and my foot after they collided at Turn 1 in Aragon in September 2018. Ducati finally gave Lorenzo a bike he could win on, but Marc blocked his line and shoved him onto the dirty part of the circuit. The crash resulted in a dislocated toe and fractured metatarsal, ruining Lorenzo's momentum just as he reconnected with his peak speed. Aragon wasn't just a lost podium, it was the future Honda garage detonating before the contracts even started. Lorenzo already signed for 2019, joining Marquez to build what everyone called a dream team. Under the surface, Jorge lost trust in his future teammate before they ever shared a pit box. He refused to escalate the clash to race direction because he already knew what they would say, implying the institutional outcome was fixed. A 5-time champion admitting the system protects the star changes how we view that era. The foot injury became the first crack before the Honda empire collapsed. Lorenzo walked into a garage built around Marquez's gravity, trying to adapt to the most physical bike on the grid while carrying a lingering injury. The RC213V demanded front-end commitment that Jorge hated, and his confidence vanished while Marc kept winning Sundays. Honda kept cycling champions through that graveyard, squeezing Dani Pedrosa out, breaking Lorenzo mentally and eventually destroying Marquez's own body when he tried to drag the machine beyond physics. We look at Aragon 2018 differently now. Lorenzo didn't look shocked in the gravel. He looked like a rider who recognized the move his future teammate was willing to make into a cold first corner. Once trust disappears, riders tighten lines and second-guess every entry. The old guard hated the modern philosophy, but the factory backed the results. Lorenzo retired battered a year later, proving the super team fantasy was actually a warning sign for disaster. The tribal war skipped a generation and landed right in the middle of 2026. Marco Bezzecchi told Crash this past April that Marc is strong everywhere, a massive admission following their collision at Mugello. Bezzecchi admitted fault, apologized to the Ducati garage, and broke the narrative the internet wanted. Mugello exposed that the grid still measures itself against the number 93, even while acting exhausted by the noise. The guy Marco hit is the same rider half the paddock treats like a threat to their identity. Pecco Bagnaia mocked Alex Marquez during that same weekend, claiming the younger brother was putting on a show after the penalty drama. That comment wasn't normal Friday frustration. Bagnaia knew exactly what he was doing in front of the Italian media, weaponizing the surname to defend VR46 territory. Every incident around a Marquez instantly becomes tribal warfare, treating overtakes like evidence in a courtroom case that started a decade ago. The yellow shirts in the grandstand still carry that old scar tissue. Bezzecchi's apology mattered because owning fault weakens your side in a tribal environment. Fans want retaliation, but Marco chose honesty. He described Marc's smoothness and corner speed using veteran language, recognizing the advantage instead of throwing generic PR compliments. Riders hate admitting someone else forces them into mistakes. The fact Bezzecchi praised him publicly feeds the feeling that Marquez never leaves their heads once he stalks them on track. The 2026 season feels weirdly tragic for the Marquez camp. Madrid double surgeries in May, a foot fracture at Le Mans, and the ghosts of past collisions hanging over every weekend. He doesn't ride like the invincible kid who dive-bombed the grid without fear. He walks through the paddock while everybody analyzes if his body language changed, yet the stopwatch still says danger. The paddock could move on if he faded, but he keeps entering corners like the old king refusing to die. Since the RC213V nightmare and the endless surgeries, the older hatred softened for some fans. Watching a champion drag himself through pain changes perception. That sympathy creates an impossible atmosphere where riders respect his survival but hate racing him. He stalks races, waits, brakes late one lap and rides smooth the next 5. You can't settle against him. The Mugello tension proved that underneath all the penalties, the paddock fears what happens if he wins another title after everyone declared him finished. If Marc wins a championship on a Ducati after the body collapse, the entire Civil War argument changes forever. That possibility turns every weekend into a political battlefield. Ducati garage politics are getting messy, with Bagnaia defending his crown, Marquez carrying factory expectations, and the VR46-linked riders drifting between respect and resentment. The comments get dissected for hidden meaning, the interviews become coded language, and the old Malaysian ghost just sits there watching the new kids tear each other apart. We pretend the younger generation only inherited the racing side of the rivalry, but they inherited the emotional debris too. Sepang proved that once the paddock code breaks, the fragments poison everything that follows. Bezzecchi accidentally cut through the noise by admitting Marc is still one of the hardest riders on earth to beat. If he was washed, the rivalry would die naturally. We don't argue about irrelevant riders for a decade. We argue because the threat still feels real every Sunday. Name one rider from the 500cc era who didn't eventually become cynical about the politics around winning titles. 1. I'll wait. Every generation reaches the same place where innocence dies first. Wayne Rainey's era talked about limits without needing a steward's document, but modern MotoGP runs on corporate expectations. Dorna expanded the calendar, Liberty Media bought the show, and riders absorbed the physical consequences while the factories cashed the checks. We watched Honda destroy its own legacy by feeding riders to an unrideable bike. The stewards make it worse by refereeing the sport based on reputation instead of consequence. They penalized Rossi in 2015, ignored Marquez in Argentina 2018, and now hand out long lap penalties for minor aero wash incidents while ignoring major dive bombs. The inconsistency turns the fin panel into a roulette wheel. Riders don't trust the officials, they don't trust the factories, and after incidents like Laguna Seca or Aragon, they stop trusting each other. The grid becomes a grid of isolated survivors instead of competitors. Yol dragged Fenati for grabbing a brake lever at Misano, claiming he crossed a sacred line. But how many factory riders kept their seats after repeated dangerous complaints because they still brought podiums? Speed buys silence until the damage becomes impossible to hide. The paddock forgives aggression if the sponsor money keeps flowing. We want heroes and villains, but the reality is just a machine spitting out broken bodies while we cheer. Which side are you really on? The ones who say MotoGP is safer now, or the ones who watch the injury list grow every single sprint weekend? One generation is lying. The bikes demand superhuman commitment. The aero wash removes overtaking zones, and riders throw themselves into turn 1 praying the tyre temperature holds. The old guard survived violent power bands, but the modern grid survives structural exhaustion while Liberty Media plans more street circuits. The Civil War feeds on that exhaustion. When riders are tired, the filters drop. Bagnaia snaps at Alex Marquez. Lorenzo calls out race direction. Stoner tells the media he's done with the circus. The pressure cooker explodes because the sport demands PR perfection while manufacturing tribal hatred for engagement. Rossi built the emotional empire, Marquez challenged it, and now every rider caught in the crossfire has to answer questions about a feud they didn't start. Every modern penalty gets debated through the lens of past grievances. A rider runs wide in Catalunya and Twitter immediately brings up Jerez 2005. A collision happens at Assen and the comments mention Sepang 2015. We watch an ongoing soap opera where the evidence file keeps getting thicker. The riders know it too, which is why their Parc Fermé body language matters more than the press releases. The cold glances tell the real story. You can see the burden on Marc's face sometimes. He knows every mistake gets archived forever while other riders get their crashes dismissed. He dragged himself back from 4 surgeries, reinvented his riding style for the Ducati, and still walks into Mugello knowing half the crowd wants him to fail. That level of endurance separates the elite from the guys who just ride fast. Marc Marquez walks back into the Sachsenring paddock next month. The shoulder still dictates how late he can break into turn 1. The factory Ducati garage waits for the data while the VR46 camp watches the sector times. If the body language tells the truth after Friday practice, we'll know what the rest of this season actually means.